The food garden here at the UBC Botanical Garden is a little different from what you might find in a backyard or a community garden plot. Most visitors will recognize the typical beds of greens and tomatoes, but you'll also find other plants, growing tall, going to seed, and budding with flowers you've never seen before. These plants are not rare or unusual. Many are vegetables you'd find in your grocery store or your fridge at home. Here, they're simply in a different stage of their life cycle, one that many of us are not used to seeing. Not only are these plants beneficial teachers, showing visitors a side of their food that they've never seen before, but they also provide a host of benefits to the garden ecosystem. Welcome to Garden Ecologies. I'm your host Alison, and I'll be taking you into the UBC Botanical Garden to learn from horticulturists about how they're incorporating ecological and regenerative practices into their work, what that journey has looked like for them, and what they've learned in the process. Hearing their experiences, I hope you'll learn something new, find some inspiration to try new things in your own garden, and perhaps start to think about gardening in a new way. Today, I'm here with Linda Layne, who manages the food garden at the UBC Botanical Garden, to talk about how ecological practices and a little bit of patience can support a resilient and healthy food garden. We'll explore the specific practices that Linda makes use of in her work, as well as how they relate to the garden's role as an educational space, as well as an aesthetic one.
My name is Linda. I am a horticulturalist. I work at the Botanical Garden at UBC. My main responsibility is managing and working in the food garden, which is a demonstration, educational focused food garden.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background and how that influences your work and your perspective here?
I have a visual arts degree with a major in printmaking and ceramics, which are both artistic practices that involve a lot of deferred gratification and a lot of creative process. So I think that's really relevant for this. For all gardening, I think it's really relevant. And then I worked on a organic farm when I finished art school, and then I worked for a potter, glazing and kiln technician. And then I started getting involved in the landscaping field and did my apprenticeship. And I've just had the incredible good fortune to work in a lot of different areas and have some excellent mentors in those spaces. So each place, the priorities are different, the client's needs are different, resources are different.
And what's unique about working here?
I guess the focus on food plants makes this horticultural job different from the other jobs, because the other jobs were much more kind of a beautiful space for the public or a functional safe space for the public or those kinds of things. Well, this is demonstrating foods that you can grow in our environment and hopefully some kind of techniques to help and grow those foods.
And what kinds of ecological practices do you use when you're growing those foods?
I'm a big believer in mulch. I don't spray. I don't use herbicides of any kind. And I have a weakness for inviting wildlife. I let plants go to seed. Most of them attract beneficial insects and or pollinators, which I love because I feel like then those beneficial insects are helping me out. Maybe not immediately, but their offspring will be helping me out. Things are not immediate when you do things organically, which I think really relates to the printmaking and the ceramics, where there's a lot of deferred processes before you get to the final product. Yeah, so I'm a huge believer in mulch and living mulches. So I have crops that I use predominantly to help moderate the climate, so that to cool down the growing environment around my celery and my fennel. I grow a lot of buckwheat, which is a very tall, transparent, airy plant. Attracts beneficial insects, attracts pollinators, but the airiness of the plant casts a slight bit of shade on my crops that need to stay cooler. So it's, instead of using a shade cloth, I'm using a plant for that purpose.
And what are the other benefits of using a plant instead of a shade cloth?
Well, you're providing a bit of a mulch because the plant is helping to protect the soil from compaction. So one of the reasons why I use mulch is to protect the structure of the soil from compaction, because the way soil particles are held together is created by organic processes. So microorganisms in the soil, worms, roots, all help to kind of loosely fit soil particles together so that there's space for water and oxygen, and it's easy for roots to move through the soil, but it's not a loose dust. Really good soil actually kind of has it holds, there's kind of a crumbling, and that is precious. It takes a while to get made, and if you can protect that from compaction from rain, which we get a lot of here, then that soil is more useful for your plants and your roots of your plants. So something like buckwheat, it casts a little bit of shade, it cools the plants it's growing amongst, it also protects soil between those plants from being compacted by rain, and then the roots of the buckwheat also help protect the soil. So I could use straw, which I do, and leaf, which I do, between plants, but they don't necessarily provide the same benefits as a living plant can.
Living plant roots create a matrix within the soil, giving it structure that can withstand erosion from water or wind. What kind of benefits do you notice in the plants that you are growing alongside those living mulches? Like, do you find that it's more productive?
I think because I do so much of it, I don't have a contrast or a control group. It's not as rigorous as an experiment. I feel like my plants do really well, and especially the plants that like cooler temperatures, I feel like they hold better in the summer. They bolt less frequently. I have a really fantastic insect population, and I think that's wonderful. Not only for the pollination and successful fruit set of the plants that require fruit set, like the tomatoes and the berries, but also just you get more of the predator insects which eat other insects. And so I feel like I'm getting more of a balanced, dynamic ecosystem of those living organisms. You might get your prey insects. You might build up a very large population before the predator insects can realize there's a population and they come along, and so eventually you do get this kind of balance between the populations. You're never going to eliminate the aphids, but they can be moderated by other insects as a real win.
This kind of balanced ecosystem of insects won't build up in the same way in a garden that uses pesticides. Not only do pesticides take out the bottom layer of the insect food chain, but they can also inadvertently harm non-target insects, even really important species like bees.
Mulching is also excellent for retaining water in the soil, so you don't have to water as frequently. So whether that's a living mulch or the straw or the partly rotted leaves, there's nutrient transfer that can happen, but just retaining moisture in the soil is great.
Hearing about the practices that she uses in the garden, I began to see how Linda's background as an artist connects to her work as a horticulturist. Gardening by nature requires a lot of patience, much like the art forms that Linda has experience with. I started to wonder what she's learned through this process of delayed gratification, from taking the time to pay attention to changes in the garden and how plants respond.
Well, this bed is a great example because it gets really intense sun. It also gets really intense shade. And over the course of the growing season, those windows shift because of the roof of this building and the angle of the sun. And so the plants have told me where they can thrive optimally in this particular bed, and which plants that are maybe pollinator friendly that need more sun don't thrive. There's a little patch. You can see I've got some Brussels sprouts there, and that is that's the sunny zone, and then the rest of that bed turns into a perennial fuchsia. And I have tried planting tea in there, Camellia sinensis, but they need more consistent dapple shade as opposed to full shade and then full hot sun. So the plants do tell you when they're happy, that's for sure, and they tell you when they're not. And when they're stressed, you're more likely to get an insect population, aphids, or foliage will change color. So yeah, you definitely learn from observing and paying attention to differences even within the same bed.
So if plants are stressed, you're more likely to have insects?
Oh, definitely.
Really?
Yeah, and disease. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. They're a little bit like us. When we're stressed, if we're studying for finals and we're not getting enough sleep, we might be eating a lot more sugar to stay up late to study, we're more likely to get a cold afterwards because our immune system is not quite as on it to protect us from what we might be normally being exposed to that we're fine with. So plants, when they get stressed, they're way more susceptible to disease and pests and smaller fruit. If they don't have enough nutrition, often they will grow differently. So like sunflowers, if I have sunflowers in a bed and there's not enough nutrition for the sunflowers, they'll get quite long between the nodes. It's like they're searching for more sun before they can put out another leaf, as opposed to sunflowers that are grown in really excellent soil can be quite dense in terms of their foliage. So you learn about kind of how to recognize what the soil needs from what the plant is telling you.
I also was wondering if you could talk a little bit about letting plants go to seed and watching them throughout their life cycle, and maybe how that's different from a typical food garden and what people can learn from coming here.
I guess, because all of the things I do have like multiple reasons. It's not just kind of the one. It's like a lot of graduated thinking, a lot of parallel lines that overlap. So one of the things I observed when I first started working here was people not recognizing the plant for the part of the plant that they ate. So not recognize a carrot because they're used to seeing the edible part in the store, but not seeing the upper part, or even the blueberries when they're not showing fruit. People don't recognize them. There's a lot of plants that happens to. So I then kind of got curious about how people would recognize a plant if it were in the mature part of its life cycle. If you let it go to flower, are people going to recognize that as a plant? And people don't actually understand that plants have a life cycle. Because you go to the store, you buy your carrot, and you don't really think about, it's grown from seed. Where does the seed come from? Well, the carrot needs to produce the seed because you need to let the carrot go to flower to produce the seed. And that, I think, is a really important piece for food security. So to educate kids so kids know this concept of plants having a full life cycle, and that's how you get the seeds to plant the next crop of plants, is to let them flower. So there's that piece about like wanting people to know what the life cycle looks like, which then leads into like seed saving, which is an amazing sustainable feature that's really important for food security. There's also the fact that a lot of plants get called attractive for pollinators. Well, it's only good for pollinators if it goes to flower, and people don't always know that. So radishes, sure, you can grow radishes and harvest radishes. You're not going to get any pollinators unless you let some of those radishes go to flower. So that whole insect piece that I find really important in terms of like trying to get the insects to help me have a balanced ecosystem, I need to let plants go to flower for that. And once you get into pollinators, there's like a whole bunch of other issues about like having a food source for your pollinator populations that last all season. And then once you have a food source for pollinators that lasts all season, and not all flowers are pollinator friendly. Like I really have to like pay attention to that. And then flowers don't flower all year. Of that, like a radish only flowers at a certain time based on the age of the tuber. And so to have enough crops that can flower over the course of the growing season into the fall, and then you want to provide a habitat for the pollinators to overwinter in. I know that it's really kind of popular to attract pollinators, and I think it's really important to attract pollinators and other beneficial insects. Like wasps are super handy, but you can't just plant cosmos and think that you're fulfilling that need in the ecosystem, in your garden, in your neighborhood, in your city. It's more complex than that. So to have a whole bunch of things to go to flower. So we've got, seed saving, life cycle, pollinators. I also just find it beautiful. So just on a totally art nerd aesthetic, I just find it gorgeous to let things go to flower and be surprised at what it looks like. Like a little tiny radish will make a 5-foot tall, totally flower-studded mass that you wouldn't recognize, and you wouldn't know that it was radish, but the pollinators love it. Love it. Yeah. And having some beauty in the garden, I think that's important for me too, right? Yeah. And if you let things go their whole life cycle, so for some things to go to flower, they need to overwinter. And so then you're having, it might not be an actively living mulch, you might not, but you still have roots that are in the ground that are breaking down in the ground over the winter, and that breakdown is helping your soil ecosystem again. So it's all kind of like overlaps, right?
I like how you're talking about like the delayed gratification, because that does sound like a lot of what you're talking about with like letting plants live out their life cycles. You're going to see things that you wouldn't expect. You're going to learn things that you wouldn't expect and
totally
have benefits that you wouldn't get otherwise.
Yeah, like the turnips went to flower this year and they were a completely different yellow. I've never let turnips go to flower before, but they were a completely different, very ornamental yellow than the other brassicas, because again, overwintering vegetables, sometimes you just don't get around to eating them all. Sometimes they bolt before you get a chance to eating them, and once they bolt, you know that the underground tuber is going to be too witty. It's just a thing. So why eat it at that point if it's already bolted? Just bolt away and feed everybody else.
We can learn a lot from Linda's unique perspective on horticulture. Approaching things from different backgrounds allows for new ways of seeing and for developing practices in novel ways. Her philosophy of delayed gratification and patience allows us to understand things that may not be immediately apparent at first glance. Additionally, the practices she uses that align with this philosophy, like living mulches and letting plants go to seed, work together to strengthen the natural ecosystem within the garden, while also providing an opportunity for visitors to learn about a new side of plants that they're already familiar with. Though the food garden is primarily an educational garden, it also provides an aesthetic experience to visitors. As Linda explains, though, the visual experience also includes the pleasure of being surprised by the plants and how they may grow differently than you might have expected. That surprise and the strangeness of seeing what we don't expect adds to the beauty that's already there. Seeing this garden from Linda's perspective, there are so many layers to these plants and so many beautiful and wonderful details to notice. So I encourage you to reflect on how your own unique background shapes how you approach gardening. How does your perspective shape the practices you use, or how you think about them? How can other perspectives change your approach and encourage you to try things you haven't before? Thank you for listening to Garden Ecologies. I hope you'll join me again next time.